Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, Chapter 4, Halacha 1. We're going to get into something that's a little bit different way to harvest, and I think that's why Chapter 4 is going to start focusing on this. We know that Peah is generally given to the poor when the product is attached to the ground. But now we're going to get into strange farming situations, like if something's growing up a wall or something like that, or up a very, very high area. So it's going to start to change things, but it's going to start to create a distinction on how the sages are organizing the practical halacha, and also going to deepen our idea and understanding of what is harvesting. So the Mishnah starts off saying, Peah is generally given to the poor, while the produce is attached to the ground. We know that a portion of the crop is going to be designated as Peah while it's attached to the ground, says the Rosh Cirillo, and it is left to the poor to take on their own, with each poor person taking as much as he can gather. And the Gemara is going to give the scriptural source for the law, says the Rosh Cirillo, if the owner did not leave the Peah attached to the ground, he is still obligated in the mitzvah of Peah and must give the Peah from the cut produce. And we know that from chapter 2 and chapter 3. So now we're going to get into a very different kind of harvesting. So it says, the Mishnah says, however, in the case of a trellised vine or date palm, the owner does not give Peah on the tree or the vine, but rather brings it down and distributes it equally to the poor who are present. And that's a very big distinction. It's a very big departure from what we had. Before we had where the poor person goes out to the field, picks up the stuff himself, and then goes home. This now is where the farmer is climbing up this trellised vine or this date palm, harvesting it, bringing it down, and equally distributing it to the poor. That's a big hiddush. And Rabbi Shimon adds to this. In the Mishnah, he says, Rabbi Shimon says, Peah of the smooth walnut tree as well is brought down by the owner and distributed equally to the poor. And that's also a big hiddush. So it looks like, hey, wait a second. So maybe there could be other types of trees that have this particular way of harvesting. It would look like from the Mishnah, perhaps it's only these two kinds of trees, like the trellis vine or the date palm. And Rabbi Shimon is saying, no, there's another one as well. And what that opens up is the possibility that perhaps this is a hekesh where it could apply to all kinds of hard to get at trees, or perhaps what it's saying is it's saying no, it's just applying to these particular ones. And that's going to be a topic of debate. Anytime you're getting this in a Mishnah where it's listing a couple of types that are very specific, you always have to look at whether this is going to be for these specific things or it's going to be a generalization. And that's always a thing that you have to look at when you're studying the Mishnah and looking at how it's going to apply to the Halacha. So we want to look at this because this is different. Normally, a trellis vine is a tall vine that's going to be put on a wooden frame or a tree even, and it's going to be draped over it. And it's very hard to climb that kind of vine. And perhaps it's even hard to climb up that wooden frame. You might break it or damage it, and then you'll be liable for damages. So we know that that kind of vine is going to be difficult to climb. And also, the Rosh Cirillo says that similarly, a date palm is difficult to climb since it has a very tall and straight tree that lacks branches for support. So this is something that you really have to be specialized to do. You can go on line and you can see sort of tribal people climbing coconut trees, and they've been doing this for a long time. But I mean, you're sitting here listening to this. Could you climb a coconut tree to get coconuts? Probably not. And certainly, unless you've grown up doing it or this is your profession, it's pretty hard to do. And I think that's part of the point. That's going to get into it. So I want to look at the Rosh Cirillo to help us to explain this, because this is a big departure from what we were talking about. It's a different way. I mean, it has to be harvested. We know that the grapevines are subject to Peah, but now this is something that comes out to be very different. So the Rosh Cirillo says that whereas ordinarily the owner merely leaves the Peah for the poor to take on his own, in these cases the owner must bring it down and distribute it. Thus, Peah of the trellis vine and date palm differ from ordinary Peah in two ways. The owner does not leave it attached to the vine or tree, but cuts it and brings it down himself. And we're going to see a scriptural source for that in this Gemara. And the second way is that he does not place the Peah produce before the poor and leave it for them to grab freely, but rather he distributes it equally to the poor who are present. And this is a rabbinic enactment instituted to prevent the owner from having favoritism and putting the Peah produce where he harvests in a place where someone he's partial to will have an easier time getting it to it than others. So this is going to be different because we saw also with the Peah, the standing crop, there's no favoritism. I mean, you just cut it, you leave it, and who comes and gets it, gets it. But in this kind of case, you're purposely going to harvest it, and perhaps there are people there. So you can't just put it down and then let people grab at it, because perhaps the person is going to favor a neighbor or something. You can't do that. It has to be equal. It has to be equally done to all poor people. And that's something that we know in the Torah. It's supposed to be blind. There's not supposed to be any favoritism to it for Peah. So this is a way where it's a big departure, and it's probably the only way you could distribute it in a way where it's keeping with this Torah idea, where it could be freely accessible to all poor people. In other words, if you went and harvested it and you just put it down, you're going to get crooked people coming and putting it for certain poor people, not all poor people. It has to be access to all poor people. That's the point. Like with other types of things, it has to have access to poor people or rich people. But with this one, it's defined as poor people. Well, which poor people, right? So in this case, it's really designated for all poor people. So I think this rabbinic enactment is a way where it can still be distributed, to the poor and keep the basic idea of the Torah. But this is a departure from what we see. But this might just be a practical halacha and a practical way to do it, because there might not be any other way that's reasonable to do it. So the Mishnah is going to now go on this basic law mentioned at the beginning of the Mishnah, that ordinarily the owner leaves Peah uncut for the poor person to take on his own. But now we have this different case. So the Mishnah reads, even if 99 of the poor people present say to distribute Peah equally, and one says it should be left attached to the ground for them to grab freely, we listen to that one, for he said in accordance to the Halacha. Now, we know that that's the case. We know that if you have standing grain at the end, that's what the Torah says, that's the way you're supposed to do it. And all the poor people are there waiting except for one, and they all say, no, we want to do it where you're going to give 99 portions to us and we're going to share it equally. And one person says, no, it's not like that. He's correct. That's the way the halacha is, that you have to do it that way. Okay? And that's going to help us to deepen our idea of how we're thinking. By the way, on the number 99, that's just an example here of an overwhelming majority. So that's why it picks that number. It's not a an arbitrary number. It's just using that as a tool to help us to understand that is vastly outnumbered. So even if you're vastly outnumbered, the halacha is not like that. And we know that also with witnesses. Perhaps there are 1,000 Jewish women, and there's only 2 Jewish men. Well, we know, for witnesses the way it works, right? So that's using that sort of tool. Now the next part. Next part is the big chiddush here. However, in the case of a trellis vine or a date palm, where the halacha requires the owner to cut down the peah and distribute equally to the poor, it is not so. Rather, the opposite is true. The Mishnah reads, even if 99 of the poor people present say it should be left to them to grab freely, and one says to distribute it equally, we listen to that one, for he has said in accordance with the halacha. So the Rosh is going to say like this. The Rosh is going to say that even if he is motivated by the fact that he is old or sick and stands to gain a greater share by equal distribution than by open competition, his preference prevails since it is in accordance with the basic law that in this case grants each poor person the right to an equal share. So the Mishnah is implying that were all the poor people present to agree that peah of the trellis vine or date palm be left attached and available to free competition, their will would be respected. But in this case, we have one dissenter, and that one dissenter is enough to change it. So let's get into the Gemara. And the Gemara is going to cite a baraisa that gives the source for the Mishnah's rulings. It was taught in a baraisa. It is written, quote, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not finish off the corner of your field as you reap. We know that from Leviticus 23:22, and also in Leviticus 19:9, where Peah is first mentioned. So this is going to be interesting because it's going to look at the dikduk on how it's written. Let me read that for you again. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not finish off the corner of your field as you reap. Now, I just want to point out that the word used here is bekitziracha, that it's using a form of the word kotzer. So this is going to be something that's going to come up because other types of trees are going to use other words to mention harvest. So I want to look at the Vilna Gaon's comment here. Vilna Gaon says, if the Torah would have stated, "You shall not gather in the corner of your field," it would denote that after the entire field is cut, the grain from the corner should be left for the poor. But by stating, "You shall not finish off the corner of your field," the Torah teaches that one should leave the corner uncut for the poor to take on their own. And the Vilna Gaon continues, says, furthermore, as you reap at the end of the verse is taken to mean that when reaping, in other words, cutting the grain, one should leave the corner uncut. So that's a deep way to understand how this is being written in the Torah. We know that the beginning and the end of the verse is using the word katsir or form of it, and that's going to be cutting specifically for grain. Now we know that in Hebrew there's different verbs for harvesting different types of produce. For instance, botzer is going to be for harvesting grapes, and that's going to be used in Leviticus 25:5. Or there's another word, mosek, which is going to be referring to harvesting olives, and we know that in the Rashi for Shabbos 73b, and in the Bavli actually writes it in Yevamos 116b. But specifically, kotzer refers to the harvesting of grain, and that's something that's very specific. So now we see that you have these other types of things, and so maybe there's something going on with the halacha with the way it's written. So let's find out. So the verse says, or the baraisa says, from here we derive that peah is given while the produce is attached to the ground. Again, it has to do with kotzer, and you have the not to finish off your field, which is using a variation of the word kotzer and gather in, so that we could see that it's dealing with grain. So the Brisa continues, says it might be thought that the obligation to leave peah attached to the ground, even in the case of a trellis vine or a date palm, and the Torah therefore states that the law in the context of katsir, which is referring to a grain harvest. So this is teaching that the requirement to leave peah attached to the ground for the poor is cut on their own, applies only to crops that are similar to grain, as follows. So the Brisa continues, and it says, just as the grain harvest is distinctive in that a short person can access its attached produce as easily as a tall person, so too other crops that share this characteristic are subject to the law. And so basically what the Pnei Moshe here is saying is he's saying that the Torah stated the law that the peah is to be left attached to the ground only regarding a situation where, as in the case of grain, leaving it to the poor to cut on their own will not give some of the poor an advantage over others. In other words, it has to equally be done. And that's what's special about the grain, according to what the Pnei Moshe is pointing out, that basically tall or short, anybody can do it. There's no special preference that's being given. So that's going to help us understand why this halacha is going to be this way. So excluded, says the Brisa, therefore, are the trellis vine and the date palm, where a short person cannot access the attached produce as easily as a tall person. So I want to look at the Pnei Moshe again to help us to get more insight on this. And he says that due to the height of the trellis vine or date palm, a tall person has easy access to the fruit by climbing, whereas a short person can't, either because of physical limitations, or he will be endangered, or because he's frightened. So you could imagine that you might have some very, very old people, and to say, oh well, you have to go harvest your peah, and it's up there on the top of the tree. Good luck climbing it, and it's a palm tree. It's just straight. There's no branches to climb. Yeah, what are you going to do with a 92-year-old person to go climb up to go get it? Very, very difficult. So that poses a big problem. I mean, you drive around Israel and you see groves of date palms. So, okay, poor people will know where the date palms are. And to say, okay, well, here's the date palms. This is all we grow here. We don't have anything else. And the food's there. And if you want to eat, you have to climb up to go get it. Wow, that's really tough. That's really tough. So, Baruch Hashem, the law is not going to be like that. So, but we're seeing why this is going to be particularly different. So there's going to be an alternate source for the Mishnah's ruling. And the Sugya says, there are those who wish to derive the law regarding peah that it must be left attached to the ground, except in the cases of the trellis vine or date palm, from the following source taught in the Brisa. And it says, quote, the verse states, for the poor and the proselyte, the convert, you shall leave them. And we know that from Leviticus 19:10. And the verse is going to be referred to peah and oleos, which are undeveloped grape clusters, and parrot, which are fallen grapes, and lechet, which are the gleanings. And we know that that's going to be something that's going to be a right for the poor people. So the sugya continues, and it says, this denotes leave peah attached to the ground before the poor, and grain in its stalks, fenugreek in its stalks. So then you have the rest of the Brisa reading, and dates in their brooms. And we know just from a quick explanation of, by the Rosh Cirillo, that branches of the date palm are referred to as brooms because they are commonly used as brooms. And this is a reference to low-lying date brooms, which are accessible without any danger, in contrast to the dates growing at the top of the date palm, which is going to be discussed later. But the term that you shall leave denotes that the farmer is not to do anything with the peah, but leave it as it is, attached to the ground, along with the shaft. And the Mara Fulda points out, although the Gemara's point in bringing this exposition is to teach that the owner should leave the peah attached, we learn an additional law as well, namely that the poor are entitled to both peah produce itself and its chaff. So, if, however, the wind separated the chaff from the fruit before the owner designated as peah, the poor person is not entitled to the chaff. So that's also a chiddush. So why would somebody want the chaff? Well, you can use it for baking bread. In the case of wheat, you can use it for fertilizer. You can even use it for brewing. I know that people use it in for brewing. So perhaps you even want to just use it to make vinegar. They use a lot of leftover grain, particularly when there's a lot of poverty and they don't have for leftovers from grapes and vineyards, that they'll use leftovers from the grain farm for making vinegar. So it does have value. So that's something that they're also entitled to. So the Brisa continues and says, it might be thought that in the case of a trellis vine and a date palm, the same law applies, that peah should be left attached to the vine and date palm. But the Torah therefore states, you shall leave them. And this implies that the requirement to leave peah attached, alluded to in you shall leave, applies only to some types of produce, them, and not to all types. So the Brisa continues, it says, on what basis did you see fit to include these peah of fields and most trees in the requirement of leaving the peah attached, and to exclude these, the peah of trellis vines and the date palms, from the requirement? So the Mara Fulda here is saying that the Torah merely states a general exclusion with the word them, but gives no indication as to which peah produce should be left attached and which not. And according to the previous Brice's approach, the Torah clearly indicates by specifying grain which peah should be left attached. It is the peah of all crops that are similar to grain, and in some of the poor will not gain an advantage over others. So, so we can see that this low-hanging fruit, so to speak, or these low-hanging things that are not dangerous or not scary to harvest from, and that are easy for access for all people, that this is going to be included in the word them. So the Brisa continues, and it says, the scripture includes some produce through the phrase you shall leave, and excludes others through the word them. So really this is Gemara style for the Yerushalmi, really getting into the dikduk, so that you can really understand how to pull the halacha out from the scripture. And again, nobody alive knows scripture this well, and nobody alive has this tradition on how to do it, but the Yerushalmi walks us through this tradition that we once had, and which came from Moshe Rabbeinu, and is showing you the logic of how we're deriving this halacha. And I'm really happy that this is preserved so we can do that. So let me read it again, because it's really neat the way the Yerushalmi goes into the dikduk. It says, since scripture includes some produce through the phrase you shall leave, and excludes others through the word them. So the Gemara continues, says, logic dictates that I include these, the peah of fields and most trees that do not involve danger. And I exclude these, the peah of trellis vine and the date palm that involve danger. So I want to look at the Rosh Hashanah for some help on this. And this is the determining factor, says the Rosh Hashanah, of whether leaving the peah attached presents a danger to the poor, who would have to cut it on their own. And the height and the flimsiness of the trellis vine, and the height and lack of branches for the date palm, these are going to be dangerous things. And he continues and says, combined with the competitive nature of the poor who climb, it would present a potentially dangerous situation. In other words, what the Rosh Hashanah is pointing out is you might actually have many poor people trying to climb the same tree without branches, and really creating a dangerous situation where everybody's scrambling to get the peah. So that's something that that we have to keep in mind. So to avoid this situation, says the Mara Fulda, the Torah obligated the owner who will exercise caution to cut the peah and bring it down to the poor. Now, Shenos Eliyahu is pointing out that, and this is going to be in 34a of, no, this is going to be in the Shenos Eliyahu. And it says that it's noteworthy that the scriptural source stated here, as well as the one cited in the previous Baraisa, teaches only that the owner who cuts the peah. However, the law that he should distribute it equally to the poor is not derived from here. Rather, that part is a rabbinic enactment designed to prevent favoritism. So that's an interesting chiddush. There's going to be others like the Rosh Cirillo, who are going to point out that that the first Brisa's approach only teaches the owner to cut the peah, and the later Brisa is going to have a different approach, teaching that he has to distribute it to the poor. And this is because the verse in question contains two clauses. One is that you shall not finish off the corner of your field, and two is that for the poor person and the proselyte, the convert, you shall leave them. And according to the first Brisa, the owner of the trellis vine or date palm is excluded only from the prohibition of you shall not finish off, but he's still subject to the law, you shall leave them for the poor to take on their own. And the reason he distributes them must therefore be on a rabbinic enactment designed to preclude favoritism. So that's a real chiddush here from the Rosh Cirillo pointing this out. In other words, he's saying that the first verse implies that that he has to leave it, but it's the second verse that's showing that that these people are going to be included. And so that if you're taking this verse and that verse, that's how you're coming up with the halacha, with the exception of the distribution. So interesting insight that the Rosh Cirillo is saying that this Gemara is proving that this is really the halacha from how the dikduk and the mikra is in the Torah itself. So that these parts are going to be deraita, effectively is what the Rosh Cirillo is saying that these two barisas are saying, but this part about the distribution, this is rabbinic. So, having clarified the source of the law with respect to the trellis vine and the date palm, the mitzvah of peah with cut produce is going to be asked about. So the Mishnah, the Gemara continues. It says, does the pay obligation of the trellis vine and the date palm take effect while the produce is still attached, or only after the produce is detached? So the Pnei Moshe here points out that since the obligation to separate peah has already taken effect, he must designate some of the produce as peah prior to cutting the produce. In this respect, these fruits are not different than other produce, which must be designated as peah before being cut off. Because, again, you have the prohibition of you shall not finish off. That's part of the Torah. So the Gemara is going to explain the halachic ramification of this question. It says, if you say that the pay obligation takes effect while the produce is attached, the owner must designate it as peah while it is still above on the vine or the tree. But if, however, you say that the pay obligation takes effect only after the produce is detached, he designates it as peah below, in other words, after he cuts it down from the vine or the tree. So I want to look at one of the commentators here from Biur Halacha. So this is going to come from the Rosh Mishantz. And he says that it is pointless to designate a portion of the produce as peah while it is attached, since the pay obligation has yet to take effect. It seems clear that from the Gemara that the owner does not discharge his obligation by merely leaving a portion of the produce for the poor. Rather, he must first designate it as Peah. And this is clearly stated in Torah's Kohanim to Kedoshim 1:9. So that's a interesting chiddush by the Rosh Mishantz. So let me read that again. It says, if you say that the pay obligation takes effect while the produce is detached, the owner, says the sugya, must attach it as peah while it's still above on the vine or tree. And the sugya continues, says, if, however, you say that the pay obligation takes effect only after the produce is detached, he designates it as peah below after he's brought it down from the vine or the tree. So the Gemara is going to explain how this concerns the poor people as well. And the Brisa continues. It says, if you say that he designates the peah while it is still above on the vine or the tree, the expense involved in bringing down the peah from the vine or the tree is incurred by the poor people. But if you say that he designates the peah below, the expense involved in bringing down the peah is incurred by the owner. So as soon as the owner basically is going to be designating it, a portion of the attached produce as peah, those fruits become the property of the poor at large. When subsequently he brings down the peah, he's bringing down their produce and doing their work, and as such, he can subtract from their portion an amount of fruit equal in value to the expense he incurred in bringing down their portion. This is the note by the Pnei Moshe. So this is interesting that there is a compensation that comes about because he's putting in the time and the labor. In other words, let's say he has a specialist who's very good at climbing this tree, and he says, okay, go take, a quarter of an hour to go and climb the tree and go get it. So this is somebody's time, and he's entitled, in giving to the poor. Again, we always have a thing, you shall not favor the poor, that if he's incurring the expense, that it's supposed to be covered. So that's what that's saying. But the Gemara is going to reject the premise that the inquiry has a ramification as a respect to who incurs the expense for bringing down the produce. So there's another brisa that says, even if you say that the owner designates the peah while the produce is above on the tree or trellis, the rabbis burden the owner and declare that he should incur the expense of bringing down the peah because of the danger that could result from leaving the burden upon the poor. So this other brisa has an interesting chiddush explanation from the Vilna Gaon, and he says that if the expense would be incurred by the poor, there is concern that they may wish to spare the expense by agreeing to cut the peah on their own, which would place them in a dangerous situation. And it emerges that the expense of cutting down the peah is definitely incurred by the owner. However, it remains unresolved whether the expense is under biblical law, because it is not yet designated as peah, or by a rabbinic decree so as to avoid a dangerous situation. So that's a really deep chiddush and explanation by the Vilna Gaon. On a practical level, it seems unresolved whether the peah on the trellis and the date palm should be designated before or after being cut. That's I think with this counter verse, this counter sugya, that's really what it's leaving it as. It's, in other words, it's on a practical level, it's unresolved whether the peah of the vine or the date palm should be designated before or after being cut. But we know that the owner is supposed to go up and do the service to cut it and bring it down. And as the Vilna Gaon is pointing out, it's unresolved whether that part should be under biblical law or it's under rabbinic. That's a big question. It's unclear. So the Mishnah cited two opinions as to which trees are excluded from the general rule that Peah is to be left attached to the ground. And the Tana Kama excluded only the trellis vine and the date palm, but Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai excluded the smooth walnut tree as well. So the Gemara is now going to talk about this and bring in a third opinion. So the Brisa says, it was taught in a Brisa in the name of Rabbi Meir that all trees pose a danger to the poor. Consequently, the owner cuts down the peah for all trees and distributes it to the poor. So in other words, were it necessary for them to climb the tree and cut the peah themselves, they would always be in danger. And that's really the point of what we were talking about in the last halacha. In other words, you would say that, well, the owner is spending the time to go and do it. He's taking the guy who spends a quarter of an hour, climb up the tree and go get it. And it's really necessary to do, says the second Brisa, because otherwise poor people would say, no, I don't want you deducting that. I'm going to go do it myself and then place them in danger. And we have a suffix here, says the Vilna Gaon, that, hey, we're not sure whether that endangerment is going to be biblical or rabbinic. We're not sure. So it's clear that in the practical halacha that the owner has to cut it and bring it down, but we're not sure whether that's going to be d'oraita or d'rabbanan. But we know that basically, hey, there's a concern for the danger, and Rabbi Meir in this Baraisa is saying that all trees pose a danger to the poor, and that's why it's the owner who cuts down the pay of all trees and distributes to the poor. So the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, shall we say that Rabbi Meir does not expound the term katsir, which we know is a grain harvest, in the manner that the first Baraisa said above, whereas the rabbis who excluded only the trellised vine and the date palm expound the term katsir in the manner of the first Baraisa? So basically, what this is saying that the first Baraisa in this halacha was talking about the term katsir, which is a grain harvest, and that's teaching that the requirement to leave peah attached to the ground applies only to the crops that are like grain. So, in other words, crops that are equally accessible to tall and short people. And the Baraisa now is explaining that this is going to exclude the trellis vine and the date palm, which are not accessible to short people as they are to tall people, or, certainly it excludes, very, very old people. So the rabbi's opinion is going to fit with, this explanation. In other words, Rabbi Meir's opinion is not going to fit with the rabbi's opinion. He's putting in a basis to preclude all trees, and since some of the fruit trees have low branches, and old people or short people as well as tall people could get it, Rabbi Meir is gonna agree with this this other Baraisa, which is gonna expound the term otam, which is them, which means them, as excluding crops whose cutting involves danger from the requirement of leaving peah. So Rabbi Meir, therefore, is going to exclude all trees from the attached requirement. So the Brisa continues, and it says that, however, we must give consideration to the element of danger as well. Now, Rabbi Meir says that all trees pose a danger to the poor, and if peah is to be left attached to the tree, therefore he rules that the owner must cut down the peah of all trees. But the rabbis say that there is no danger except in the cases of the trellis vine and the date palm alone. Therefore, the owner cuts down the peah in these cases. So I want to look at commentary from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in Safe 75 in his Biurim to help us to understand this sugya and what Rabbi Meir is saying. So this is from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Safe 75. Rabbi Meir concedes that under biblical law, the owner must bring down only the peah of the trellis vine and the date palm. And since, however, he views the peah of all trees as posing a potential danger to the poor, he holds that the owner is required by rabbinic decree to bring them down for the peah of every other type of tree. The rabbis, on the other hand, maintain that no such decree was imposed, for the danger was minimal, except in the case of the trellis vine and the date palm. So that's a really interesting way to explain what's happening. In other words, one way to explain it is to say that Rabbi Meir is saying that by Doraita, it's these two things, the trellis vine and the date palm, but all other trees are Darabanan. And the rabbis, on the other hand, are saying that no such decree was imposed except for the trellis vine and the date palm. So there's another explanation that the point of the Gemara's answer is that even the explanation of the word katsir, which teaches that peah is left attached only when it is equally accessible to short and tall alike, and certainly to old, is contingent upon the danger factor. And the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis is as follows. Rabbi Meir is maintaining that removing the produce from even ordinary trees poses a danger, at least to the smaller and weaker among the poor, and accordingly, all trees are considered less accessible to the small and weaker among the poor, to whom they all pose a danger, and are therefore excluded from having their peah left attached. So that's one way to help explain what Rabbi Meir is saying. The rabbis are going to hold a different view. They're going to maintain that the peah of the ordinary tree is equally accessible for all, because trees do not pose a serious risk even to the smaller and weaker among the poor, and accordingly, the equally accessible stipulation does not exclude them. Perhaps what the rabbis are saying is that they're saying, well, there can be low-hanging fruit, and certainly shorter or old people will have no problems taking them. I mean, I walk outside my house and there's a fig tree, and some are very, very high, but certainly, it's very easy for any person, even a child, to come in to grab a lot of these figs off the low branches. So this exclusion is going to pertain, says the rabbis, only to the trellis vine and the date palm, which present a serious danger to smaller and weaker among the poor, making them more accessible to the bigger and stronger. So that's a really deep insight on what's happening. And the Mishnah is going to state that Rabbi Shimon, says the sugya, says that peah of the smooth walnut tree as well is brought down by the owner and distributed to the poor. So Rabbi Shimon's view is based on the contention that leaving the peah of the smooth walnut tree attached for the poor to cut on their own would pose a danger to them. And the Gemara is going to cite an incident which supports his view. So the sugya continues and says, Rabbi Hananiah says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, it once happened that 5 brothers died on 5 smooth walnut trees while reaping their attached peah. So I want to point out that the Derech Hamuna points out that although the Gemara cites an incident in support of Rabbi Shimon's view, this ruling is going to be in accordance with the Tana Kama that peah of the smooth walnut tree is left attached for the poor to cut on their own. you can see in the Derech Hamuna 2:135, and that's 2:135, chapter 2:135. So even though you had this horrible tragedy where five brothers died on five different smooth walnut trees, that's the halacha is not going to be like it's not going to be like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rather, it's going to be like the sages. So the Gemara is going to address the Mishnah's ruling that ordinary pay is left for the poor to cut on their own. And it says like this: it says, if the owner designated a portion of his attached produce as Peah and then finished off his field, he cut down the produce designed as or designated as Peah in violation of the Torah's command to leave it attached for the poor to cut on their own. And the verse continues, the sugya continues, says, I still apply to him the verse which is coming from Leviticus 23:22. It says, you shall not finish off the corner of your field as you reap, for the poor person and the proselyte you shall leave them. Thus, he must leave the cut Peah for the poor to take on their own in open competition. Furthermore, says the sugya, even if the owner did not designate any of the attached produce as Peah, and he finished off his field without designating any Peah whatsoever, in which case he is required to designate a portion of cut produce as Peah. So I just want to look at the Vilna Gaon's approach on this. I'm sorry, I want to look at the Rosh's approach on this. And the Rosh is saying like this. He's saying that ordinary Peah must, one, be attached to the ground, and two, taken by the poor in open competition without the owner's involvement. We already know that. So the Gemara, according to the Rosh, is teaching that here, even if the prohibition against cutting down the Peah was violated, the law that the owner not be involved in its distribution remains unchanged. And accordingly, he cuts Peah for the poor, that also remains unchanged. So accordingly, he leaves a cut Peah for the poor to take on their own in open competition. The mitzvah of Peah is going to be to separate it from the standing crop. And if one did not separate it from the standing crop, he separates it from the sheaves. So that's the important point to keep in mind here. So the sugya continues, says, I still apply to him the verse, quote, you shall not finish off the corner of your field as you reap. For the poor person and the convert, you shall leave them. In other words, it's saying that he must leave the cut Peah for the poor person to take on their own in open competition. And we know that, again, we're going to look at the Rosh for an explanation of this. The ruling in this case represents a greater novelty than in the preceding one. In the preceding one, the law, says the Rosh, is that the Peah be left for the poor to cut and take an open competition, and that already took effect when it was attached, since the owner designated as Peah in the attached state. In the present case, in this new case, however, the Peah was not designated as Peah while attached. As such, the law that the Peah be left attached for the poor to cut was never applicable. And one might therefore have thought that the second implication as well, that the poor should take an open competition, is inapplicable. And the Gemara is teaching, according to the Rosh, that this is not so, and even in this case, the Peah is left for the poor to take on their own in open competition. So that's a deeper insight on how this is happening about the competition. So, in other words, in this second part, if you're gonna read this verse as you shall not finish off the corner of your field as you reap, for the poor person and the convert you shall leave them. In other words, that's being read as you must leave the cut Peah for the poor to take on their own open competition, and that this is going to represent the right to biblical law. So the sugya is going to continue. It says, however, the poor people at large stipulated among themselves that biblical law not be followed in this case. And even if one of the poor people present insists that the peah be taken in open competition in accordance with biblical law, nevertheless, we do not listen to him. Rather, the owner should distribute the peah with his hand equally among the assembled poor, in order that the owner should not see a poor person who is his acquaintance and throw the peah before him, giving him an unfair advantage over others. And we know that, there were cases, when you go look in the Megillah and Ruth in chapter 3, Halacha 2, that you could have issues where you have a friend or a relative there and getting an unfair advantage. So I want to look at the biur by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein to help us to explain this. It says, because the poor person at large stipulated, perhaps even in conjunction with a bet din, that the biblical law of competition be set aside in this case, even if one or more poor people present demand that it be followed, that's that in other words it's being set aside. So it's trying to to push that in order for the person not to get an unfair advantage, that the owner is going to distribute it equally rather than place it before the poor, because he could be having favoritism, and he could put the peah in a place where it's close to somebody that he likes, and this is the source of the Mishnah's ruling concerning the trellis vine and the date palm, that the owner, after cutting down this hard to get, dangerous to get produce, distributes to the poor equally. So if you look at the Rosh, he's going to have an approach where if all the poor people who are present agree to the open competition, their will is going to be respected, just as it is respected if all agree to open competition concerning peah of the trellis vine and date palm. But even if one person, according to the Rosh's point, is that if one person dissents, then the halacha is going to be like him. So the Gemara is going to talk about a general consensus that the law be established in this matter, and there's going to be a Amara who's in doubt on the matter. So the sugya says, Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma inquired, if one finished off his field without designating peah, you say that the peah obligation returns to the sheaves. In other words, what Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma is saying, he's saying that the owner is biblically mandated to designate a portion of the sheaves as peah. And biblical law further mandates that in this case, as in the usual case of attached peah, the owner leaves the peah for the poor to take on their own open competition. And the sugya continues, says, do we say, however, that nevertheless, since the peah has been cut, the owner should distribute it with his hand equally among the poor, so that he should not see a poor person who is his acquaintance and throw the peah before him? In other words, he's saying, to give this, this friend an advantage over the others, or is this rabbi saying that the owner follows biblical law and simply leaves the cut peah for the poor person to take in open competition? So I want to look at the Mara Fulda here for an approach on this question. So it says that Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma remains in doubt concerning this matter, though the previous Gemara stated unequivocally that the owner must distribute the Peah equally by hand. Others explain that Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma also means to rule definitively that the owner distributes the Peah equally by hand. However, the previous Gemara stated this in regard to the Peah of the trellis vine and the date palm, and Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma says that this same law applies to Peah of the grain in the event that the owner went ahead and cut it. Now, I want to point out the Vilna Gaon's approach, and he has a different way to understand this. So let's take a look. So in this presentation of the Gemara, we were looking at the Rosh, and in the Vilna Gaon's Shenos Eliyahu, is going to be he's going to present the Gemara as three independent sugyas. He's going to break it up into three. So the Vilna Gaon breaks up the first sugya, breaks it up into a first sugya, and amends the text so that it reads that if the owner designated a portion of his attached produce as Peah, then he finished off the field. In other words, he cut down the produce designated as Peah, and then it says, I apply to him the verse, you shall not finish off the corner as you reap. And if the owner did not designate any of the attached produce as Peah, and he finished off the field without designating any Peah whatsoever, I apply to him the verse, you shall not finish off your field as you reap. So the Vilna Gaon is saying that the Gemara teaches, when broken up this way, that whether one designates a portion of his attached produce as Peah and then cuts down the designated Peah, or cuts down his entire field without designating Peah, he has violated the prohibition of you shall not finish off the corner of your field as you reap. And the first law is derived from the word pa'at, which means the corner, which refers to the portion designated as Peah. And the second law is derived from the word sedecha, your field, which refers to the entire field that has no Peah designated. So it's noteworthy that, according to the Vilna Gaon's understanding of the Gemara, that the Gemara states explicitly that the prohibition, that it's applicable even after the produce is designated as Peah. So then he breaks up the second part of the sugya into a second sugya, and he reads it like this. It says, if the owner and the poor stipulated between themselves that the owner should keep the attached Peah portion for himself and give the poor an equal measure of his own cut produce in its stead, nevertheless, although the poor agreed on this, we do not listen to him, the owner. So the Vilna Gaon's pointing out on this way to write it for us, this second sugya, in other words, to rearrange it so this is the second sugya. The Vilna Gaon's comment is like this. It says that the stipulation would result in the cut produce, which he is now giving to the poor, gaining Peah status, which is exempt from tithes, and the attached produce, which he is taking for himself, losing its Peah status and accordingly subject to the tithes. And this stipulation is not valid. Rather, the attached produce kept by the owner retains its Peah status and is exempt from tithes, while the cut produce given to the poor remains as non-Peah and is subject to the tithes. And then he's going to cut up the third part of this, and here's how it goes. So the Gemara then begins a new segment addressing the Mishnah's ruling that the owner brings down the fruit of the trellis vine and date palm and distribute to the poor. And lest one think that this means that he places it before them in open competition, the Gemara is going to explain that the Mishnah means that the owner distributes with his hand an equal share of the Peah to each poor person, so that he amends the text. The Vilna Gaon amends the text so that it would say that were he to place it before them in open competition, there is concern that perhaps he might see a poor person who is his acquaintance and throw the Peah before him, giving him an unfair advantage over poor people. So I want to continue with the Vilna Gaon's explanation on this. And Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma goes on to inquire whether this pertains also to the pay of produce that the owner cut down unlawfully, an issue that was not previously discussed according to the Vilna Gaon's interpretation of the Gemara. So, do we say that since the Peah is presently in the owner's possession, he must distribute it equally? Or perhaps we say that the owner's original obligation to leave the Peah attached for the poor person to take on their own in open competition remains in effect even now that the Peah is in his possession. And the Gemara resolves the inquiry by responding, even in this case, the owner distributes it, lest he throw it before the poor person who is his acquaintance, so that to give him an unfair advantage. So that according to the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma's inquiry is resolved, whereas according to other readings of this and other ways to break it up, the question by Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma is left in doubt. So by breaking up this entire sugya into three different parts, then there's really no question, says the Vilna Gaon. But if you're reading it all together, then Rabbi Shmuel bar Avudma's question leaves it as a suffix. So anyway, there's a lot to think about here about deepening the idea of trying to do something where we're treating the poor equally, because again, this is supposed to be left to all poor people. What if you're creating a situation where only young people can climb the tree, not old people? Well, then it's not really equal for all poor people. So I think that's why the rabbis instituted that it's distributed equally after it's being harvested. So that's a deeper idea here. Anyway, tomorrow we'll continue with Halacha 2 in chapter 4. Have a great day.